The subject of this video would be, in many regards, the final expression of Soviet battlefield management systems. It would seek to provide a complex akin to Vozduk for armies, divisions, and regiments, allowing for surface-to-air missiles employed by the ground forces to coordinate seamlessly with the PVO, subunits to stream elements of the battlefield to one another in real time, and the complete computerization of the rear services. It was to be largely immune to electronic attacks and highly mobile to reduce the risk of triangulation. This meant that the command cabins that made up the wider network had to be fast enough to keep up with the units they were attached to, through the use of an existing vehicle or series of vehicles. To meet these demands, nearly 3 decades of work and some of the best computer scientists the Union had to offer would be required. What came of this program would be something truly revolutionary. But this video would not be complete if I just told the story of the device in question, as the impressive technology that allowed for it to function only came to exist through a grueling process that shattered friendships, professional relations, and in some cases, the careers of those involved. This is the harrowing tale of...
Заходи, посиди, поговорим.
Не о том, не о сём, о проблемах семьи.
Заходи, посиди и не унывай.
Это дело такое.
Ты гадай, не гадай.
Я иду на работу, ты заходишь домой. Посоветуй, дорогая, что мне делать с тобой? Меня замучили подруги, я забыл про покой. Помоги, научи, что мне делать с тобой?
Ты идешь на дискотеку, я иду домой. Я вырубаю телевизор, я играю отбой. Ты сама по себе, ты себе на уме. Я тебя запоминаю, забываю о тебе.
Ты,
я,
такие времена.
Я целый день один, ты целый день сама.
Я себя не понимаю тебя, но извини.
Я улетаю
один,
навсегда.
Наступает вечер, все подряд, наделяем лица чистотой. Мне так интересен этот взгляд, без сомнения он только твой. А к чему тебе время быстротечно? А зачем тебе это не любовь? А к чему тебе ждать не будешь вечно? А зачем тебе?
Like most automated command and control systems produced in the Soviet Union, Maneuver was first conceptualized in the 1960s. As the decade drew to a close, Yuri Podrezov, head of OKB-864, would be appointed its chief designer, and tasked with organizing preliminary research. In 1969, just 1 year after his assignment to the Maneuver project, Podrezov saw yet another career advancement when he became the director of an emerging department dedicated to pursuing computerized command and control, known as the Research Institute of Automation, or NISA. Due to Podrezov assuming this position, Maneuver required a new chief designer. The man who would be chosen for this role was Robert Nikolaev, Before work could begin, as with all new technology, a great deal of argumentation would be required to determine its usefulness within the theoretical framework of the Soviet Army. A limited contingent of traditionalists hailing from the signal troops opposed its existence, and believed that it would serve only one purpose, that being the overcomplication of an already functional network. To thoroughly refute them, a prototype would have to be constructed, and trialed at the tactical level. However, before this can be discussed, it is important to dive into what Maneuver was trying to do, and why it was important. The battlefield of the late 1960s and early 1970s was relatively opaque. The ability for subunits to communicate with one another was available, but this was limited to conventional radio lines, which could only provide so much information. The speed in which said information could be delivered was also especially problematic, meaning that by the time it was received by the party that needed it most, it was subject to varying degrees of inaccuracy. These issues scaled exponentially at the divisional and army level. The larger a combined arms maneuver, the more disorganized it would become, especially with the speed afforded by modern systems like infantry fighting vehicles. To keep track of where everything was, and by extension where the enemy was, an unfathomable volume of personnel was required. This was doable in ideal conditions, but nigh impossible when electronic interference was introduced. If communications were ablated and alternative solutions employed, such as mail carriers and telephone lines, offensives could slow to a crawl, and the initiative would be lost. The expected rate of advance that the Soviet Army was hoping to achieve in a European war effectively mandated the real-time transmission and reception of information. This is what Maneuver sought to achieve. Units would be capable of updating their current and intended position while on the march. This could also be done for enemy positions, meaning that a live map of known troop movements could be created with the assistance of drones. Air defense assets would also be capable of plugging into this network, meaning that higher-level systems like Vector could in theory interact with lower-level systems like Kub, and provide them with data on enemy aircraft. This would be the final step towards realizing a comprehensive visualization of the battlefield without delay. While all of this was well and good, before the project could even get started, the Military Academy of Communications in Leningrad produced a rather pessimistic study, stating that it would be impossible with existing technology to develop such a system. The academic consensus did not deter Nikolaev, and he quickly got to work assembling a team of specialists. Ivan Ivanchuk, his deputy, would be selected to create these early tactical prototypes. He was well acquainted with command cabins, as he had previously designed almost identical facilities for Vozduk 1P. He was quite excited by the theoretical capabilities of the platform, and was therefore happy to help. Due to the scope of the project, Nikolaev required the assistance of another deputy. Nikolai Azamatov would assume this position. He was chosen as a result of former advocacy for automated command and control at the tactical level, and was therefore excited to work on the solution. An element that made the development of Maneuver unique, compared to projects that had come before it, was the fact that most of those involved had experience designing the previous generation of automated command and control systems, such as Vozduk, ASURK-1, and Krab. The issue was that all of the aforementioned systems were only operational when stationary. No one at this time understood the complexities of designing something similar that functioned on the move. As the project got underway, the 16th Central Research Institute of Communications was tasked with collaborating with OKB-864, primarily to supply radios and associated equipment. At this organization, an individual known as Bakhmutov would dedicate his department to helping the team. He actively rejected the findings of those in Leningrad, and worked to find solutions to the technological gaps outlined in the study. His department would produce an electronic keyboard and display system, so that messages could be sent and edited, both revolutionary pieces of technology that were foreign to previous command and control systems. These messages would be transmitted digitally by a new system known as Basalt, at a speed of 1,200 bits per second, over one of 3 channels. With Bakhmutov's contributions, it was finally possible to begin tactical trials, the result of which were encouraging, and allowed for data transmission requirements to be drafted. The success of these early prototypes greenlit the project, meaning that work could begin on variants for use at the army and front level. However, this was a blessing and a curse, as the signal troops would now be involved directly with the development process. Considering that the year was 1970, collaboration was managed by none other than Colonel General A.I. Belov, a man OKB-864 would soon learn to despise. Almost immediately, Bakhmutov's department was disbanded, and much of its staff dismissed due to disagreements. Many of those who no longer had positions at the 16th Central Research Institute would find themselves at OKB-864 in Minsk, unable to share documentation with those they previously worked with. As this event transpired, a new requirement was drafted into the program. It read, ASUV Maneuver must use only communication equipment already in service or entering service. Existing methods must be preserved. Voice transmission has priority over digital. This caused progress to be effectively halted on the new Basalt data transmission system, which was now being developed without any consultation from OKB-864 due to the reorganizations. On top of this complication, the requirements mandating the prioritization of voice communication got in the way of digital exchange networks that had already been established, meaning it was especially easy to interrupt the flow of data with the push of a single button. Because those at the divisional level were not yet equipped with their own digital workstations, there was no way to reach them without pushing the aforementioned button, meaning that it was impossible to multitask. The demands to use existing communication systems were also needlessly problematic, as none of them were capable of interfacing with Basalt, meaning that Belov would have to budge on this requirement, or Basalt would need to change, and Belov was not known for budging. Decades later, once all was said and done, those who worked on the project noted that after his introduction into the program, work carried on not because of Belov, but despite him. Now that work had begun in earnest, it was important to select a family of armored vehicles to house the prospective automated command and control system. MTLVU was chosen for this purpose, as at that time there were very few options that fit the criteria, and designing a unique platform would only serve to complicate development through the involvement of further ministries. Unfortunately, despite the enormity of this variant, it was still not large enough to accommodate communications equipment, computers, and the 5 occupants expected to operate these subsystems. These problems were largely the result of the vehicle's layout. The interior volume was much smaller than its exterior, due to the placement of the engine. This meant that anyone seated centrally would enjoy a smooth ride, while those in the rear compartment would be subjected to conditions so inhospitable that troop control was effectively impossible. This problem was also experienced in the driver's compartment, but in this case, they could see the road and therefore were capable of bracing themselves.
What the MTLBU is, and how pleasant it is to ride in, I learned from my own experience back in 1971. I found out that specialists from the 16th TSNIIS would be in Brunitsy, near Moscow. There is a tank test track there, conducting studies on the effect of contact interference on radio communications quality while moving. This work was led by Major Fedyaev from Malchukov's department. We wrote the appropriate letters to the customer and to the 16th TS NIIS asking to be admitted to the tests. We received permission for me and Grisha Salogub, he worked in my laboratory, to attend. At the appointed time, we arrived in Brunitsy. We found the unit we needed, where armored vehicles were being tested on a large tank track. The tank track is a very long road with asphalt sections, swampy stretches, concrete irregularities like a washboard, and so on. The experiment consisted of installing 2 VHF radios in an MTLB without the U, and without the backpack that carried power station, working into whip antennas. Fedyaev sat as the radio operator at one of the radios. Communications were maintained with another VHF radio installed in one of the unit's buildings. There was no other equipment in the MTLB hall except 2 benches along the sides. We had to sit on those benches during the experiment. The point of the experiment was that Fedyaev and his correspondent at the other radio alternatively transmitted special texts by voice. This made it possible to determine speech intelligibility. The second radio in the MTLB was switched on. Interference appeared. Intelligibility dropped. The results were used to assess the influence of contact interference on communication quality. I'm writing about this in detail to show at what primitively low level work was in the Ministry of Defense's leading communications institute in the early 1970s when it came to evaluating communications in moving armored vehicles. After the breakup of the Bakhmutov-Rykov department, the 16th TS NIIS no longer had specialists evaluating communications channels for transmitting telecode signals in the tactical echelon of command. In our institute at that time, we had already specially developed SACS instruments, statistical analyzer of communications channels, that allowed us to assess the quality of digital signal transmission over channels, including between moving objects. Grisha and I sat down on the benches in the MTLB and set off. Fedyaev established communications and worked his program. When the MTLB's speed reached 30 to 40 kilometers an hour, Grisha and I didn't know what to hold on to so as to not fall off the bench and smash our heads. The din was such that it was impossible to talk. A few hours on the tank track in the MTLB were enough for us to understand what awaited us in the KSHM we were designing on the MTLB-U base. We marked our travel orders and left for Minsk. Primitive assessments of voice communications under interference were of little interest to us. Fedyaev, as it turned out later, was collecting experimental data for his candidate's dissertation. Soon, Grisha Salogub transferred to another subdivision of the Institute. I think the trip to Brunitsy played no small role in that decision, and I had to meet Fedyaev many times over the next 15 years. At all tests of our objects, he was present as a member of commissions. He nitpicked terribly, searching for shortcomings in his own already adopted communications equipment, forcing us to eliminate them. He simply wrote remarks into the minutes. For example, the communications range while the KSHM is moving is not ensured. And the fact that the method of determining a radio station's range, written into its technical specifications, does not take into account the presence in the vehicle of another radio working on transmit next to it was not considered. Do whatever you want, but the communications range must be ensured. After the first trips in the KSHM prototypes around the range, our guys, the developers, declared, until Malashuk, the Institute's chief accountant, Malashuk Nina Konstantinova, rides in these vehicles and doubles our pay, we won't ride in them. Malashuk, of course, didn't appear at the range. It was winter. She didn't want to travel dozens of kilometers in an open canvas truck in which the developer testers were transported. After some time, the testers still went to the range, bounced and froze in the KSHM for the old salary. As special clothing, we were supposed to be issued Kirzovia boots, quilted trousers, and a jacket. Only in the third year of range work were we allocated a bus. I remember and think, why did the guys, qualified specialists, agree to work in such conditions for a modest salary? But they worked. Only a few left for other Minsk enterprises.
Regimental command vehicles within the Maneuver family would use BMP-1 KSH as a base. Due to its small size, the interior had to be gutted and totally reorganized to accommodate the new automated workstation. This was a lengthy process. It was noted by those in Minsk that having to work within the confines of these already existing vehicles was ultimately more trouble than it was worth. It seemed that the already existing bureaucracy was designed to interfere with OKB-864, as they expressed additional grievances with previously established standards of radio procurement, slowing down trials. It was expected that if radios would be required for a prototype, an order would have to be submitted 1 year in advance to the relevant plant. This was previously uncontested, as most understood that these sort of requests were to be made as part of a wider pre-development checklist. Those at OKB-864 most certainly knew about this, but were only now expected to use existing radios due to Belov's interference. And so, when the 20 prototype command vehicles suddenly needed more equipment than what these plants had in stock, problems arose. Each required 2 R111 radios alongside R123MT, R130M, and R405.
RP Nikolaev sits with legs dangling from the hatch, tired and gloomy. Says routinely, communications didn't work again today. And they could not. Radios were incompatible with Basalt DTE because switching time was not standardized. Internal communication equipment connected via unshielded cables. Contact interference, reduced range 3-4 times, many other causes.
And he had every right to be upset. Deadlines were fast approaching, and many at the OKB feared that the lot they had been dealt might negatively impact their careers if the program fell through. Sadly, these concerns would be realized when V.I. Gladyshev approached the Bureau to inform them they had failed to meet the Council of Ministers' expectations. And, indeed, someone would have to be punished. Ivanchuk would become that scapegoat. Luckily, his position at the Institute remained, but his role as one of Maneuver's chief designers was over. Nikolaev followed behind him, not because of an order to do so, but disillusionment with the program. This was an especially low point for OKB-864, but one Nikolai Azamatov made it his mission to prove that while they may be down, they were most certainly not out. Immediately, it was determined that indeed none of the radios present within the prototype command vehicle were compatible with the automated equipment that they were expected to interface with. This was already known by OKB-864 and had been stressed nearly a decade ago, but limited tactical trials confirmed that communication range dropped by a factor of 7 during simultaneous transmissions. Additionally, the analog channels employed by the complex were incapable of reliably delivering voice commands, as well as converted digital signal transmissions, meaning that everything the team had assembled up to this point would need to be reworked. There was also a lack of standardization, impacting the performance of the complex. At this time, there was no system in place to determine when radios were switched on and when they were switched off, across a formation, meaning that when signals were sent over this network, they were often lost. Additionally, the antennas supplied for use on the prototype command vehicles were wholly unsuited to the task. This was especially problematic, as it revealed to the team that a technological revolution within the signal troops would be required to facilitate integration with Maneuver. When this data was presented to the relevant parties, they informed OKB-864 that they could handle it however they pleased, but it was expected that they were to handle it, and that failure to do so would result in the failure of the program.
Our institute was part of the Ministry of Radio Industry. Chief designer of the ASUV, UD Podrezov, could not directly influence the developers and manufacturers of communications equipment. Those enterprises belonged to another ministry, the MPSS, and the customer for all communications equipment was the CST, NVS, whose representatives were the ones writing us remarks about communications equipment. It may seem smeshno. First they demanded we use specific communications equipment, and then they began writing remarks completely to the wrong address. But we were not in a laughing mood. Tests were suspended. Deadlines were missed. All remarks were consolidated into a plan of measures, specifying what would be done to eliminate the remark, when, and by whom. Each point of the plan had to be coordinated with the customer's representative at our institute. After a specific remark was eliminated in documentation and verified in the KSHM, including trips to the range, together with the customer's representative, an act of eliminating the remark was drawn up. But to obtain this act, one had to go down a long, thorny path of bureaucratic red tape. It was necessary to write letters setting out the Commission's remarks to our ministry, to the MPSS, to our customer, to the plant manufacturer of the communications equipment, to the ordering directorate for that equipment. As a rule, this concerned serial communications equipment produced for the troops. Letters could circulate for months before the needed visas and signatures appeared. In some cases, we had to, as we said, give the letter legs. We would go to Moscow to our ministry. In the main directorate, from our curator, I would take the letter. All correspondence at that time was under the secret classification. And in violation of strict rules for handling such documents, tuck it under my shirt and ride public transport to the MPSS or to the customer collecting the needed visas and signatures. This was often the only way to sign the act about eliminating a remark by the required deadline. I remember and am surprised how, under such conditions, we managed to fulfill the assigned work on time. The internal communications and switching equipment, AVSK, caused us especially many worries. It was developed and produced serially at the Radio Pribor plant in Zaporozhye. The chief designer of this equipment was Boris Mikhailovich Gainsky. I will have to return to that name. All KSHM built on the BTR-70 base had AVSK of this type. We were also instructed to use it. The equipment was designed to connect and switch 4 radio stations. Our KSHM had 5 radio stations, plus the Basalt APD and a guaranteed strength telephone encryption device. All internal intercom devices and external communication lines were connected through the AVSK. The shortcomings of its switching capabilities required the development of additional units interfaced with the AVSK. The units were connected by unshielded cables. After the first stage of tests, it became clear, without a new AVSK, it would be very difficult for us. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Radio Pribor plant categorically refused to coordinate our use of this AVSK and to sign a contract for equipment supply, although we had obtained all necessary permissions. The first Basalt APD prototypes worked unstably. The component base had been chosen unsuccessfully. Sent codegrams often disappeared who knows where. This could happen for a number of reasons. For example, 2 transmitters simultaneously sent codegrams into a radio network without receiving a signal that the network was already occupied. Or some undisciplined tester, officer, or radio operator entered the network in voice mode. Remember, voice had priority over telecode. And in a 10-station network, there could be around 50 such talking enthusiasts. Or a negligent KSHM driver lowered the antennas and forgot to raise them again after passing under an obstacle. There could be other causes, including errors in the message exchange algorithm. The operator at the AWP typed a message on the display, pressed a button, and the codegram from the onboard computer went to the APD. What happened next, the operator didn't know. It vanished from his screen, and that was all. Whether it had been transmitted, whether it had reached the addressee, he didn't know. On the APD rack, in the modern unit, there was a small point indicator. The APD developers installed it for their own purposes. It clearly showed when the codegram reached the radio input and when a delivery acknowledgement arrived, but this information was available neither at the operator's workstation nor at the radio operator's workstation. Therefore, the operator, having sent a codegram, would swivel his chair almost 180 degrees and watch the instrument. The APD developers refused to output this and other telecode exchange signals to an external connector. The APD radio and APD onboard computer interfaces are coordinated, and that's it. Alas, this situation remained in later APD modifications as well. Inside the APD, there was a mass of useful information about the telecode exchange. How many errors were corrected, what the channel quality was, how many times retransmission was needed to obtain an acknowledgement, how many messages were rejected for overdue delivery time. The latter is especially important for timely detection of deliberate jamming, and much other useful information. The radio operator in the KSHM could monitor the telecode network only by ear, by connecting to the radio and risking disruption of the network. All our appeals to the APD developer and customer remained unanswered. The Basalt APD was being developed for Minsk, but we were not holders of the TTR for this equipment. The customer was the CST and VS. He likely had other interests. Not having received an acknowledgement, the sender often switched the radio to voice mode, tried to call the addressee, and ask, "Did you get my codegram about such and such or not?" Such checking disrupted the data exchange network even more. All this happened because the automation equipment, workplace gear, onboard computer, the APD, and the communications network each worked on its own. There was no single thought-out operating algorithm. There was no unified approach to designing equipment meeting the requirements of a command system. An insurmountable barrier was the small clause in the ASUV TTR. Use only what exists in the troops or has been adopted. The situation worsened further when the Beta 3M computer, placed in a separate MTLBU, was connected. It had to do work while moving, receiving initial data by radio and transmitting results to addressees. Failures were added to the computer APD interface. Messages more often began to fall into nowhere. We decided to work out all command processes on site, replacing radio networks with wired lines over which the APD operated. I suggested using chart recorders to monitor the passage of codegrams. Previously, we had used them successfully for monitoring channels in Vozduk ASU tests. A sufficient number of suitable recorders were found at the Institute and at the MEMZ. We organized operational loudspeaker communications between all workstations, all by wire. Since the KSHM stood compactly in storage boxes and on the Ploshatka, the whole test process was conducted by one conductor, Igor Vitalyevich Kuritsyn, chief designer of the Division CP and Regimental CP. Recorder tapes were strictly tied to time. Operators periodically marked the time on the tapes. From the tapes, it was clearly traced when a codegram was transmitted, whether an acknowledgement was received, and where in the network messages collided and prevented each other from being received. Tape analysis greatly puzzled the APD developers and the message addressing algorithm developers. Changes had to be urgently introduced into the APD. The mechanisms for raising and lowering antennas, the 4-meter whip for the R130M and the R123MT, the 3.4-meter whip for the R111, caused many problems for communications specialists. Because of them, communications often worsened and sometimes disappeared. These devices were serially produced by the Zaporozhye Radio Pribor plant and supplied to the troops. They were used on all KSHM built on wheeled BTR bases. But when used on the MTLBU, mechanical breakages often occurred. These mechanisms were completely redesigned by our designers and began to be manufactured at MEMZ. Contact interference caused us a lot of trouble. It arose when at least one radio switched to transmit. An armored vehicle has a mass of non-constant electrical contacts between various metal parts that, while moving, begin to rattle and rub against each other. These are hatch hinges, covers of storage boxes, entrenching tools mounted on armor, and so on. The tracks alone are something. In rubbing points, unstable electrical contacts appear. When irradiated by the powerful signal of a radio transmitter, an entire spectrum of radio interference arises. Its power is not great, but it is quite comparable to the power of the signal coming from a distant radio. As a result, communications range drops several-fold. Military specialists from the 16th TSNIIS who accompanied the order advised orally, without papers, shielded. Look for points where you must ground equipment and metal parts on the MTLBU. Select the length of HF feeders connecting the whip antennas to the HF pass-through insulator connectors installed where the feeder passes through the armor. The military communicators turned us into lab rabbits. The 16th TSNIIS representative, Fedyaev, the same who studied contact interference at Branitsi, would suggest what else we should do to achieve the range written into the radio's TTR. We had to remove all equipment from the KSHM, 2 KSHM were located for these purposes, and install grounding jumpers, either at individual points or around the perimeter of a rack, choose feeder length, shield it, remove shielding. Recall, this is all concerning existing communications equipment. No additional time was allotted for solving communications problems. After yet another set of alterations, the KSHM would drive 30 to 40 kilometers apart and check all types of communications. If we failed to meet the requirements recorded in the TTR, everything began again. It must be said that within our institute, too, the signal specialist requirements were often treated with distrust and contempt. All cable connections of equipment units inside the KSHM were done with unshielded cables and corresponding connectors, except for basalt. Thick harnesses of cables entangled the equipment racks. Naturally, interference from equipment and cables was an additional cause of reduced range. Even during the development of design cables for the prototypes, I demanded that only shielded connectors and cables be used, and the communication cables and power cables be laid separately. They laughed at me. These signal guys are inventing nonsense again. First they made up some contact interference, now they don't like cables. Management did not support me. All cable documentation was developed in Mikhail's laboratory. When I raised the need to shield cables and separate routing, he would thump his fist on his chest and say, "Don't worry, I take full responsibility. I've made lots of cables and everything was always fine." 7 years passed since 1970, and the KSHM underwent special investigations for unauthorized information leakage. After that, Sushkevich had to redo all the cables, and we signal specialists could breathe easier. But the main and saddest thing was that the KSHM radio operators and their commander, the division chief of communications, turned out to be informationally cut off from each other. I have already mentioned that at CST insistence, the division communications service was not included in the automation process. Neither the division chief of communications nor any of his officers had automated workplaces. Therefore, he could not obtain information from his subordinates about communications status or pass them any orders via telecode exchange networks. Switching the radio network to voice mode meant disrupting telecode exchange and consequently disrupting the process of automated troop command. The radio operators inside the KSHM were in an even more difficult position. Besides the KSHM communications equipment, they were supposed to maintain the automation equipment as well. Dozens of possible operating modes and hundreds of indicators on panels and boards required special qualification of radio operators to cope with their duties. The radio operator had practically no way to report to his chief about communication status or instructions received. He could transmit a message over the telecode network only like this: call one of the officers over the KSHM intercom, distracting him from his combat tasks, and ask him to transmit a message to such and such address. The division chief of communications could convey instructions to the radio operators only through the KSHM officers with automation equipment. The division chief of communications had no AWP. For communications control, one could use voice communications, for example, the R13M radio, which as a rule was not used for telecode work. But that immediately deprived the ASUV of an important quality: stealth. It is very difficult, if possible at all, for enemy radio reconnaissance to determine the affiliation of telecode radio networks. It is easy to organize false telecode exchange networks, as we did at an exercise in the Belarusian military district, misleading the EW service. What has been said is sufficient to draw the conclusion. Excluding the division communications service from the automated command process was a mistake. Or perhaps that was the intention.
Considering that revisions were already underway, it was high time that the prototype's layout saw some improvements, so that those riding in the rearmost compartment could focus on command and control rather than the possibility of sustaining a concussion. This was actually not a complicated process. The officers were moved to the center compartment, where the ride was smoothest. Supposedly, changes to the equipment layout resulted in the radio operator's relocation to the rear being relatively painless. A vital introduction which allowed for messages to be delivered with relative ease while on the move was PNFK. This was a keyboard originally conceptualized in part by Nikolaev before he abandoned the project, consisting of sentence fragments which could be used to assemble commands. Keys could be changed according to need, and would be configured preemptively. The device was positioned in such a way that to type, the user had to brace themselves against the panel, meaning that it was effectively impossible to be thrown from one's position while operating it. Despite the simplicity of its design, it took years for the PNFK to materialize. Before the program had got off the ground, a myriad of solutions to solving the aforementioned issues of typing while inside a moving vehicle were considered, including early touchscreens. Unfortunately, the relocation of the vehicle's radios to the rear compartment revealed a larger issue to those working on the platform. When in motion, the transmission range decreased substantially. This compounded on the already existing problem of frequency incompatibility, suppressing the network as a whole. While it seemed impossible to harmonize 7 radios, Vladimir Voloshin, a man who had become involved with the program in the early 1970s, was hard at work in pursuit of a solution. Now that it was possible to transmit and receive on the move, another round of testing was in order.
During the stage of state tests, a check of system operability after 50 kilometers march was planned. All the KSHM of the divisional and regimental command posts were rolled out to the Podrezov range. The KSHM were switched on, joint work with the Beta computing complex was checked, and several tasks were solved. The members of the State Commission conferred and gave the command to the vehicles. Our automation specialists and radio operators sat down at their workstations. Soldiers from the service company sat in driver's seats. Sergeants from that company sat in the navigator seats. We formed into a column and set off. At the head of the column moved a BTR-70, with an officer responsible for the march. We had already established radio communications between all KSHM. The drivers were ordered to watch for power lines, to lower the whip antennas when approaching them, and then raise them again. The tank road, heavily torn up by tracks, ran across the range, then went along a high voltage line and along dirt roads. We had to cross the Minsk-Moscow highway and a railroad crossing, and then, by dirt roads, reach the range at Golodishi. At the first power line crossing the road, the soldier drivers lowered the antennas by switching on the antenna lowering mechanisms at their workstation. They never raised them again, although red lamps were lit on the panels, a signal that the antennas were lowered. All drivers and navigators, while the column was moving, were supposed to monitor the radio range and be ready to execute the column leader's commands. Instead, both drivers and navigators turned off their helmet headsets, because, you see, the shum in the earphones mashal them. As a result, as soon as the antennas were lowered, the communications in the column were lost. All commission members and their assistants did not want to be shaken in KSHM over off-road terrain and went to the destination by bus on good road. Meanwhile, the MTLBU were shaking the soul out of us every 50 to 100 meters. There was no way to restore radio communications while moving. Looking out of the hatch, I saw that all the antennas of the vehicles ahead of us and behind of us were lying on the decks of the KSHM. My desperate gestures to the KSHM following us that the antennas had to be raised did not achieve their goal. The front vehicles naturally did not see me. Only after 30 kilometers, when the column stopped before the Moscow highway, was it possible, running around several vehicles, to force the drivers to raise the antennas and get back on communications. But running far from one's own KSHM was risky. The column could start moving. Try then to catch up with your vehicle. I describe this so that it is clear what irresponsibility and negligence existed among the participants in these tests, both civilian and military. We arrived at the range. We arranged the KSHM in groups, depicting the division CP and forward CP and the regimental CP. The commission members and their officers' assistants sat at the workstations. In each KSHM, our specialists sat at the radio operator seats, and one automated workstation was also occupied by an NIISA specialist. The checks were very serious. Therefore, the best specialists of the Institute took part in the experiment. The military issued a combat task. They began solving it using the automation means. The commission members were dissatisfied with the result. The equipment sneezed. We did not meet the standard times. A negative conclusion on the experiment was looming, and that threatened termination of the state tests. The situation was very serious. Our management bargained hard, looking for a way out of the situation. Finally, the members of the State Commission from the ordering directorates went out for a compromise, possibly convinced the developer would himself prove his incompetence. The conditions were as follows. All vehicles in the column returned by march to the Podrezov range. The inspectors sit in the KSHM. During the march, while moving, a combat task will be assigned. A certain number of tasks must be solved on the Beta computing complex, which will move as part of the column. Solve the tasks, then we will count the checkpoint, and the tests will continue. The conditions were unexpected for us. although the equipment was designed for such mode of operation. When our leader, Nikolai Ilyasovich Azamatov, announced this decision to us, we became downcast. We didn't want to return at nightfall to the range near Borisov. We were tired and hungry. Initially, lunch had not been planned. From Kolodishi, we were supposed to go to Minsk, but N.I. Azamatov knew how to persuade people, explaining to them the complexity of the situation. I, as the person responsible for communications, set a condition. An instruction briefing must be conducted for the soldier drivers and the sergeants who during movement sat in the navigator's seat next to the driver. The drivers and navigators must remain continuously on the radio net, organized in the column. The navigator must monitor the position of the antennas and control the driver in this respect. Under power lines, the antennas must be lowered not fully, but to an angle of about 45 degrees. After the danger zone is passed, the antennas must be raised to the vertical position. When a 4-meter antenna, during movement, is at a 45-degree angle, then jolts on a rough road, the antenna can touch the vehicle hull. If at that moment the transmitter switches on, then most likely the message will not be transmitted because the radio transmitter output will be shortened to the hull. Reception will also be impossible at those moments. It remained to hope that the APD would automatically use its resource of threefold retransmission of messages in the absence of a receipt acknowledgement for the codegram. We briefed the drivers and navigators in the presence of officers for solidity. We explained the task to our radio operators and operators, agreed with them on interaction. We formed into a column. We checked communications within the column and the working communications networks. It was late evening. The return route would have been covered in darkness. We set off. It should be noted that the railroad crossing and the highway crossing were handled by the military traffic police services. Before an obstacle, the column stopped, and the vehicles crossed to the other side one by one at the VAI's command. On the return trip, either we, hungry and angry, worked well, or the equipment got tired of being capricious. But all assigned tasks were solved in record time. While moving under continuous jolts and shaking, the initial data were entered on the panels. The APD and the radio stations transferred them to the beta computer. The machines solved the tasks and sent the results to the addresses. Everything went as well as possible. We used only telecode communication networks. There was no need to transmit information by voice. The inspectors were quite surprised. To assign a task during a march, solve it, obtain the solution, and even automatically the necessary information on the map, while the KSHM was moving at speed, no one had managed that before. This is what the commission members said when we returned to our base. The remaining part of the route, for about 20 kilometers, we traveled satisfied, though hungry. I looked out of the hatch and was struck by what I saw. More than 24 armored vehicles with powerful headlights, twisted on into an enormous snake. The road was uneven, full of pits, therefore the headlights would disappear for an instant, then reappear again, then shift from side to side. All of this happened amid the continuous uproar of powerful engines. The scene was mesmerizing, impressive. Unwillingly, events of mid-July 1941 came to mind, when I, a 9-year-old boy, stood with my parents at the gate of our house at the Orsha station. We heard an unusual shoom of vehicles and ran out. Along the road towards the city, the military were driving. With unbearable sadness, we watched the thin column of our troops going east. A few rattling, frail tankettes, with soldiers in bandages riding on the armor. Several trucks with soldiers, many of them also wounded, were leaving us in uncertainty, leaving us to the Germans. And the next day, the first historic salvo of Captain Flerov's rocket mortars against the wooden houses of our settlement turned it into a huge blazing bonfire. Looking at that ominously roaring, twisting, sparkling snake with its many fiery eyes, one wanted to believe that this would never happen again.
Пришел конец ей самой. 4 года мать без сына, 4 года мать без сына, 4 года мать без сына. Гришине пошли домой.
We passed by a large collective farm orchard. Our navigator sergeant told the driver to slow down. jumped off the vehicle, and disappeared into the darkness. He probably knew where to carry out the operation he had planned. After a short time, he caught up with our KSHM and barely climbed onto it, losing apples. His uniform bulged in all directions. Soon we, hungry, were devouring apples. When our rumbling and headlight-sparkling snake drove through some village, its entire population, those still on their feet, poured into the street. They threw apples at us, but catching them while moving was problematic. But it was pleasant. We arrived at our deployment location. We arranged the KSHM, we sealed them, and handed them over under guard. Then, already by bus, we went to Pechi, with a sense of duty fulfilled. The commission counted this program point as completed. The state tests of ASUV M continued.
Computing within Maneuver was initially handled by Rhythm 10, which was almost immediately replaced by Beta 3M. This computer employed the 32-bit A40 processor, capable of 500,000 operations per second, and a 600KB magnetic storage device known as ZUML75. The main purpose of the Beta 3M computer was to automatically prepare, analyze, and communicate plans for the conduct of offensive operations. In 1985, a 16MB RAM would see introduction, which significantly expanded the range of tasks the computer system could solve. A40 comes from A30, which was developed for mobile air defense systems, missile warning, air traffic control, and a number of other uses. With the emergence of monolithic microcircuits within the USSR, A40 was developed to integrate this technology. As a result, it would receive additional I/O channels and external memory. A40 would later be modernized into the A50. A30, A40, and A50 would be fully software compatible. A40 was especially important in the field of Soviet computing as it could execute a wide array of tasks simultaneously. Even with the improvements to the MTLBU, and efforts that sought to allow the system to accommodate Maneuver, it proved unsuitable for the task, and as a result, work would once again begin on finding a new transportation vector to house the complex. This would eventually culminate in a project that began work at Volgograd, being reviewed in 1979 by members of Maneuver's design team. This prototype, known as Object 940, would feature a hydropneumatic suspension that would solve all of the issues encountered while working with the MTLBU. The engine was also far quieter, meaning it did not interfere with communication equipment. This was an issue that persisted on MTLBU, despite a great deal of resources being allocated to resolving it. The integration of an attached dozer blade made it possible for Object 940 to entrench itself, which was a useful feature that would assist in the rapid erection of COPs, or command and observation points. The chassis was also more spacious, was significantly lighter, could be airdropped, had increased protection from small arms fire, and had partitions between the compartments that finally featured doors, which eliminated auditory interference between the three sections. Integrating Maneuver with Object 940 was complicated by the fact it was demanded that only new communication systems, many of which were still undergoing R&D, were to be used. These included fully transistorized devices such as R171M, R173M, R138, R134M, T219, the Argon 1M computer, a new display and graphics system, and T240S. Adopting these systems into the already existing complex was difficult and resulted in the automated command system requiring a redesign. After successful experimentation, those operating the system stated it was impossible to compare Object 940 to MTLBU-based maneuver complexes. Unfortunately, for reasons few can comprehend, MTLBU was chosen over Object 940.
Another important and instructive episode of my working biography. In mid-January 1980, the head of KTO-1, Azimatov, and I summoned me and said, "In Volgograd, there will be an important meeting on the transport base for KSHM. It is being conducted by the chief of the main staff of the ground forces. Podrezov will be at the meeting. You will accompany him. If required, you will answer questions regarding communications. I was somewhat surprised to myself. The director, the chief designer, and I, the accompanying person. After all, Podrezov already had a deputy for design matters, Latushkin Vasily Yakovlevich. He was the one dealing with problems connected to the transport base. But an order is an order. On the appointed day, we went in Podrezov's car to the airport. We boarded the plane and flew to Volgograd. At the Volgograd airport, Podrezov was met by a Factory Volga representative and taken to the hotel. And I was taken to the hotel at the plant. I was placed in a 2-bedroom room. Of acquaintances, I met only Vasily Pavlovich Korolev. He was the chief designer and deputy head of our ordering directorate, of Petrakov Yuri Alexeyevich. I knew Korolev well. I often communicated with him in Moscow and at TESS. We talked, but he could not really tell me anything, except that they would consider the new transport base and the possibility of its use instead of the MTLBU. The State Commission in its act noted many shortcomings of the MTLBU and, as a consequence, shortcomings of the KSHM. I was already familiar with this transport base. In 1979, I and a designer, Fomenko Boris Igorovich, went to Volgograd and became acquainted with its prototype. Even went to the proving ground. It was not a vehicle, but a fairy tale. One could only dream of such a base. The road wheels of the running gear of this base, which they called Potok 4, had individual hydropneumatic suspension, which ensured unprecedented smoothness of ride. At the proving grounds, over rough terrain, we drove at speeds of about 70 kilometers an hour. On road irregularities, only the claps of the valves on the shock absorbers were heard. The smoothness of ride could not be compared in any way with the MTLBU. Even at high speed, there was no need to convulsively seek support so as to not crash at a jolt into something sharp and iron. The noise created by the engine did not interfere with speaking in the middle compartment of the vehicle without any intercom devices. Hydraulic mechanical track tensioning from the driver's workplace allowed within a few seconds to change clearance from 100 to 500 centimeters. When minimum clearance was set, its height did not exceed that of a man. The vehicle floated at a speed of more than 10 kilometers an hour. At the rear were placed 2 water jet propulsors. In this case, the tracks were also tightened and water resistance decreased. At the front of the vehicle was an automatically controlled self-entrenching device, controlled by the driver. He opened the blade, made several runs in reverse, and dug a shelter in the ground with it. The external motor generator was extracted from the front part of the hull by a special crane arm and could operate at some distance from the vehicle. The power supply system was unified for the transport base and the equipment installed in it. I note that in the MTLBU, the power supply system of the base and the equipment were separated, since the developer of the MTLBU did not permit making the electrical networks unified. Therefore, in RKSHM, the accumulator batteries and the diesel generator in the backpack were autonomous. The diesel generator had to operate even during the movement of the KSHM when the propulsion engine was running. In the Potok 4, the engine was started by compressed air and from accumulator batteries. In the middle of the hull, there was a large free space for officers' workplaces. The vehicles could be airdropped, for which a special platform was provided. There were also a number of substantial advantages compared with the MTLBU. For example, armor of aluminum titanium alloy, which significantly reduced the weight of the vehicle, and its bullet protection was substantially increased. The engine of the vehicle was located in the rear part of the chassis. Therefore, space for placing officers, radio operators, and equipment was much greater than in the MTLBU. The driver's place was in the front compartment, in the middle of the vehicle in a separate cabin, isolated by a solid door from the working space. To the left and the right of the driver were places of the navigator and commander during movement, with observation devices. The swivel seats of these places could rotate 180 degrees. In this case, the officers found themselves sitting facing the table of the commander's compartment. In the rear compartment, there were 2 convenient places for radio operators. There was a folding part of the seat that allowed, by means of the passage to the rear door, arranging a bunk for one of the radio operators. The radio operator's compartment was separated from the commander's compartment by a partition with a door. I will speak later about a number of advantages of KSHM manufactured on the base Potok 4. On the next day after our arrival in Volgograd, I and VP Korolev went to the plant administration for a meeting. In the director's reception room, a lot of people were crowding. Among them, I saw Boris Mikhailovich Gaisinsky, a representative of the Zaporozhye plant. The Zaporozhye plant Radio Pribor manufactured and supplied internal communications and switching equipment, AVSK, for vehicles BMD-1, KSH, and other types of BMD, which VGTZ produced in series. Gaisinsky also accompanied his director. Gaisinsky and I exchanged a few phrases. His mood was not good. He had a presentiment that urgent bad work could fall on his head. Podrezov appeared, several generals, heads of ordering directorates. The first secretary of the Volgograd Regional Party Committee participated in this meeting. Podrezov told me to wait in the reception room. Soon the chief of the main staff of the ground forces, Yakushin VS, appeared, and all the leadership disappeared into the director's office. The accompanying consultants were bored in the reception room. About 2 hours later, the leadership came out for a break. Podrezov came up, took me aside. His appearance, it seemed to me, was somewhat dejected, gloomy. He said, "A difficult question has been set before us. In 3 months, in the KBVO, there will be large exercises. They are proposing that within 2 to 3 months we manufacture, check, and roll out to the exercises 2 prototype samples of KSHM on a new transport base. Can we manage? It is too short a time, but the fate of our product will depend on this in many aspects. I must give an answer now. Do we take on this work? What is your opinion?" This question caught me unprepared. I expected anything whatsoever, only not this. And what could I answer Podrezov? That is unrealistic? That it is an adventure? He himself knew perfectly well how much time the development of such complex objects as the KSHM takes. Assignment, documentation, all of this in 3 months? My tongue did not turn to say it is impossible. Podrezov was already looking with a smirk at my bewildered look. Finally I said, "Yuri Dmitrovich, if one creates a brigade of designers, automation specialists, communication specialists, and installers, then it is possible to make it in time by doing the work in parallel." Podrezov, smirking into his mustache, went into the director's office to continue the meeting. After an hour to an hour and a half, the doors opened. The chiefs, talking animatedly, poured into the reception room. Podrezov came up and said, "A decision has been made. We will have to work. You can return to Minsk. I am flying with the chief of staff to Moscow." From conversations in the reception room, I knew that Yakushin VS had flown in by special flight on an AN-24 aircraft. I gathered impudence and asked, "Yuri Dmitrovich, maybe I can also fly on that plane?" I knew how difficult it is to buy an air ticket at an airport on the day of departure. "If you make it," he tossed out and hurried after the whole crowd of chiefs. I will not describe how I managed to jump on the move into VP Korolev's car, how we rushed for things to the hotel, and then at enormous speed raced through Volgograd. To our happiness, the VAI posts at intersections had not yet been removed. At the airport, we drove right up to the plane. The entrance door to the plane was already closed, and the gangway began to move away. Desperate waving of hands by Vasily Pavlovich, who jumped out of the car, stopped this process, and we got onto the plane. We landed at the airfield in Chkalovsk. All the chiefs already had cars waiting. They sat in their limousines and quickly drove off. A lieutenant general, apparently acquainted with Podrezov, getting into his car, asked, "Yuri Dmitrovich, shall I give you a ride?" He answered, "Yes, but there are 2 of us," nodding at me. "Get in." We arrived in Moscow, dropped off the general at his house, and the driver delivered us to the Belorusky railway station. Podrezov went up to the ticket office, where tickets by reservation were sold, exchanged jokes with the cashier, and came up to me with 2 tickets. "Well, and now we have to have lunch. Let's go to the restaurant." Yuri Dmitrovich briefly told about the course of the meeting. The chief of the main staff of the ground forces put the question bluntly. For making a decision on the new base, 2 KSHM capable of working as part of ASUV Maneuver must be delivered to the military exercises. The developer of the base assured that 2 vehicles would be in a month. Now the question to Minsk, will you manage to equip the vehicles with everything necessary for work as part of the ASUV? I imagined how those present stared at Yuri Dmitrovich and waited for one answer. No, there was too little time for the work, and the undertaking was too adventurous. But they heard the answer. We will provide it. But in a month, the transport bases and all outfitting in the communications part must be ready. On that, the meeting ended, having drawn up and signed the corresponding decision. Tomorrow, in the second half of the day, on my desk, there must lie a draft order on the necessity of urgent execution of these works. Draw it up and include in the order the list of members of the integrated brigade with indication of personal bonuses. You will lead the brigade. That was the last thing I needed, so I got stuck with this job. Of course, I did not say this to UD Podrezov. In the morning in Minsk, we were met by Podrezov's driver. He delivered the boss home and drove me up to the entrance of my house. At the Institute, I reported to Sushkevich EN, head of the Communications Division, and to N.I. Azamatov about the trip and the adopted decision. I drew up a draft order, a list of members of the brigade, and the proposed personal bonuses. The bonuses were very modest, about 10% of the salary rate. It was impossible to increase them. In the list, there turned out to be about 15 people. After a couple of days, the brigade flew to Volgograd. The others had to arrive later, as needed, and now there was enough preparatory work at the Institute. It must be said that around this new excellent transport base, Potok 4, serious passions were boiling. We, when being in Volgograd at VGTZ, heard something about it, but did not know the details. On the base Potok 4, a new light amphibious tank was being created. It stood in a corner of the factory shop distant from us, where they allotted us a place for work. As in the case of ASUV Maneuver, the ambitions and competence of certain people in power could turn out to be stronger than common sense and responsibility. The proposal to create on the base Potok 4 a new KSHM with communications and automation means was, I think, one of the steps aimed at supporting the new excellent transport base. In Volgograd, we were housed in the factory hotel in large, for 5 to 6 people, rooms. In the OKB of the plant and in the special shop, work was in full swing. It must be said that in the SKB of the plant there were several laboratories. Some were engaged in development of the base itself, the engine, modern and unique, the vehicle hull, and so on. They developed the design documentation for the base, and there was a laboratory of universalists. It was headed by Vitaly Alexeyevich Trishkin. The specialists of this laboratory could themselves weld the hull, mount electrical equipment, communications equipment, assemble and solder cables, adjust equipment, and conduct tests. The people of this laboratory were universalists, the masters for all hands. The head of the OKB, chief designer Shabalin Arkady Vasilievich, seemed to me serious, not talkative, inconspicuous, but authoritative. He treated us somewhat warily as adventurers. At first, still in Minsk, I thought that we could take all of the stuffing of the KSHM MP-21. This is what the commander's KSHM was now called. Documentation for it existed, and we would tie it to the new base, but it was not so. Azamatov said that we would install only new communication means, new radio stations. Some of them were still at the stage of state tests, and their number could be counted on fingers. To my timid objections that this would complicate the work, that we did not even have documentation for them yet, he categorically concluded, "Let them twist and install new means. We will not do it on the old ones." In Volgograd, this variant was not discussed at the meeting. Nikolai Ilyasovich, probably through our customer Petrikov UA, had already pushed through this idea and now insisted on it. Our guys worked with full Otvaga. The plant workers tried no less. Some work was performed at the Institute, but there followed continuous disruptions of deadlines. Either the necessary documents were not prepared in time, or a called specialist cannot in any way leave Minsk because of an absence of a ticket, and many other eithers. I almost daily called to Minsk. Sushkevich Azamatov reported on the progress of affairs, asked to accelerate the solution of this or that question. Requests to Sushkevich usually disappeared somewhere. Azamatov helped, but hinted that it is necessary, first of all, to address to the heads of divisions. But try from Volgograd, from the post office, on long-distance telephone, to find the head of a division, convey to him a request, or find out why the previous request was not fulfilled. Upset by the non-performance, I once, in conversation by telephone with Azamatov, raised my voice. I said that if the Institute is indifferent to the work being carried out in Volgograd, then I cannot answer for the final deadlines of the work. How he raised his voice at me. What do you allow yourself? Why are you speaking in such a tone? And so on and so forth. I understood that I went too far. After several days, I flew to Minsk. It was necessary to clarify and discuss some things, but most importantly, to agree on interaction and support. I shared my problems with Sergei Yakovlevich Glushenkov. This is the deputy head of Pashkevich's communications division. I had a long-standing confident relationship with him. I told Glushekov about my problems. He said, "Listen, I'll give you advice. Podrezov appears at the workplace at 7:30. At 8:15, the daily planning meeting. Call Podrezov from 7:30 to 8. Report on affairs and set out requests." I am to this day grateful for the wise advice of Sergei Yakovlevich. Returning to Volgograd, I began to act that way. During the day, I exchanged money, accumulated 15 kopeck coins, and went to the long-distance call point to call Minsk. It was necessary to call from a payphone, since an order through an operator was executed within an hour. To catch Podrezov in this 30-minute period of solitude was difficult. The payphone allowed doing this more precisely, but devoured coins every 20 to 30 seconds. I had to call for my own personal money. I could not submit a receipt of expenses to the accounting department. But things went like clockwork. I calmly set out to Yuri Dmitrovich the state of affairs, said what was working, what difficulties there were, asked what to send, whom to send on trip and when, and to what division. Sergei Yakovlevich was often at the planning meetings and told me about this later. One of the first questions at the planning meeting was work in Volgograd. The prestige of Podrezov himself and of the Institute was at stake. The Institute services connected to this work reported the state of affairs. Podrezov corrected them, demonstrating excellent awareness of the state of affairs. He gave concrete assignments, which were put in writing. A specific person responsible for each assignment was appointed. Try not to carry it out. Those present were surprised by the director's awareness. Only Glushenkov knew about the morning calls. Until completion of the work in Volgograd, I did not know of any serious problems with the work being performed at the Institute. Working with the plant designers was a sheer pleasure. All our requests were fulfilled quickly and to a high standard. Such an example. In the radio operator's compartment, one block in a convenient, i.e. accessible to the radio operator, place would not fit. Several oil lines of the transport base and some other pipelines interfered. They called the designer, explained to him the arisen problem. He measured something, estimated, and left. He comes in an hour with a drawing. Will such an arrangement of the pipeline suit you? The next day, the configuration of the pipelines was changed. I thought, and if in our experimental production, or at the MEMZ, it had been necessary to make such changes in something. Without a heated showdown in the director's office, it would not have been done. Documentary justification of changes would have been required, search for those responsible, new deadlines for work execution, additional payment, etc. But the Zaporozhye people here too spoiled not a little blood for us. A military representative from the Radio Pribor plant brought the new radio station R134 and the AVSK. With him came 3 developers of design documentation in the communications part for the KSHM that were already produced in series by VGTZ and the Radio Pribor plant. They immediately presented us with an ultimatum. We know none of your schemes of communications inside the KSHM and do not want to know. Here the instruction received from BM Gazinski was clearly visible. We install ourselves, our equipment in the vehicle, and then check it. Draw up an act by which we hand over the KSHM to you, and you can connect your equipment and do whatever you want. We do not answer for the consequences. I asked a question. Then what will the documentation for the KSHM look like? The answer followed. We will do our part, and what will happen with your part does not concern us. Well, complete stupidity. Samples of KSHM made on such principles could not be presented for tests. In the vehicle there would be 2 independent complexes, automation and communications, and between them, a homeless basalt. You cannot assign it to automation because it is communications equipment. The communications complex does not accept it because it does not need it. And who in that case will answer for the vehicle as a whole? The military representative of the Zaporozhye side decisively supported the developers of the AVSK, their own. I took him aside and said, "If you continue to defend this stupidity, I will immediately report this to Minsk. And as soon as information about your position reaches your leadership in Moscow, consequences for you will be sad." He squealed, said that I was threatening him, that he would complain. I answered, "Fine, complain. But until the work here is performed properly, you will not be able to return to Zaporizhia. Otherwise, I will report that you disrupted the work on creation of new samples of KSHM." The Zaporozhye people insisted on their own, and it was impossible to convince them. My alarming messages flew to Minsk. I asked the head of the OKB, Shabalin AV, to convene a meeting on this question. The meeting was convened. On the table lay two communication schemes of the KSHM, ours and the Zaporizhia one. Turned out that the head of the OKB was inclined to support the position of the Zaporozhye people. Here it is necessary to make a small digression. In Volgograd, there was a representative of 16th TS NIIS, Sudak VM, the very one about whom, in the wall newspaper of Malyuchkov's department, it was written, Karp, to Mitshy, to Minsk, Sudak. They will not meet in any way. The position of the head of the plant's SKB could be understood. The future fine fate of his brainchild, the new transport base, he tied not with Minsk but with Zaporozhye. With the Zaporozhye people, he had long and closely worked. Several types of BTR, BMD with Zaporozhye VSK had already been produced. It is not beneficial and not prestigious for any enterprise to produce a semi-finished product, a transport base. Work is a lot, but profit is little. To manufacture a transport base and supply it to Uncle Minsk is unprofitable. To themselves, fuss with the stuffing of the base with automation means is an unliftable task. It is necessary to have specialists in the new incomprehensible technique of automation means. For this, it is necessary to create new subdivisions, test stands, etc. And the chances that Minsk would supply complexes of automation means for installation in KSHM were ghostly. It was simpler to deal with the Zaporozhye people. The track for supplying AVSK had long been laid. Getting from factories, radio stations, masts, antennas, and other equipment was not difficult. To install all of this in the transport base, adjust, check, and hand over to the customer a finished product was a familiar and simple matter. And after that, let Minsk take the finished product and put its automation into the finished KSHM. If Minsk in the process would need to weld somewhere an extra bonka, relay or replace some cable, and, especially, change the balancing of the vehicle, and it would float worse, then one can immediately remove all guarantees. Such relief for the manufacturer of KSHM. But the fact that at the meeting of the chief of the main staff of the ground forces, nobody took on the courage to manufacture and present in 3 months to the exercises a KSHM on a new transport base, even without automation means, and that only Minsk undertook this work, forced them to listen to the position of Minsk. So, I asked the head of the OKB to convene a meeting and approve our scheme of communications and automation for the new KSHM. The meeting assembled, since the work in the part of stuffing the KSHM had stopped. At the meeting, the Zaporozhye people were jumping on chairs and yelling that they did not agree with Minsk's position, that by our scheme they would do nothing, and would recognize only their variant. I insisted on continuing work on our documentation, referring to the decision adopted by the chief of the main staff of the ground forces, although I myself had not seen this decision. Shabalin AV, having hesitated, made a decision. Continue work by the Minsk scheme, but you, addresses to me, will answer for disruption of the established deadlines. After which, the Zaporozhye people stated, and we still do not agree. Subsequently, they put sticks in the wheels at every convenient case. They even wanted to check communications in the finished samples of KSHM at the proving ground without our participation and draw up on this an independent act. The whole time of joint work with them in Volgograd, it was necessary to fight. Two beauties, the transport bases, were ready for installation of equipment. And then its word, firm and weighty, said the hegemon. Universalist installer assemblers from the factory of the OKB stated, we will not mount the equipment, lay the cables, until they raise our pay twice. Work again stopped. A day passes, work stands. An appeal to the head of the OKB, Shablin AV, gave no result. Wait, we will settle everything. Second day, the strike continues. Although all the guys are in the shop, we have every day counted, and here the hegemon dictates its conditions. Well, exactly the same as once at the MEMZ. I discussed with my guys the situation. We decided, if the next day the plant workers do not resume work, we will do the installation of equipment ourselves. On the third day, the situation repeated. The plant workers did not begin work. Then we ourselves received our automation equipment and basalt from the warehouse and began installation. Sasha Shirayev sat down to solder connectors to the remaining cables. The circumstance proved some agitation in the brigade of the plant workers. Negotiations with the OKB leadership accelerated, and they began work on the next, fourth day. We must give the plant workers their due. They worked great, organized. It was visible that they are class specialists. They assembled the vehicles, checked in the shop, everything works. It was necessary at the proving ground to conduct acceptance delivery tests already together with the military representative and draw up the act of readiness of the KSHM for further tests. And here the Zaporozhye people started the old thing. We ourselves, without you, i.e. the Minsk people, will conduct tests of the communication means of the KSHM in the volume of voice communications, draw up an act, and then you do what you want. How could one not be outraged by such absurd statements? And also at the final stage of work. Several days remained before shipping the vehicles to Minsk in order to make it by the start of the exercises. Again, I went to the head of the OKB, already with a demand to give an instruction to conduct checks at the proving ground in accordance with the previously agreed plan, but I did not meet understanding. The position of the head of the OKB was double. He was more satisfied with the position of the Zaporozhye people. Here is already KSHM with communication means, and Minsk adds to some of its hardware. The fact that there was a decision that assigned Minsk to develop, equip, and present tests for the KSHM, as if he forgot. A concrete decision, who and what to test, he did not make. After several days that went to tests and checks of the transport base itself, we literally, in an affirmative manner, sat our communication specialist, Sasha Shirayev, in the radio operator's place, an automation specialist, in the commander's place. Into the second vehicle, we sat another crew and began to perform checks. We completed the checks, drew up, and signed the act. To check readiness and approve, Act VI Bazhanov flew in from Moscow. He remained satisfied with the work done. We met the 3-month deadline. The plant only had left to load the vehicles and send them to Minsk. We decided to modestly mark the completion of work together with the plant workers. We bought everything necessary, what we managed to buy in stores and at the market. We decided to gather in one of the rooms of the factory hotel where we lived. Our women with sweat on their faces prepared snacks. There gathered for the farewell evening about 30 people. We invited Viktor Ivanovich Bazhanov. He came, sat at the table, chewed something, but did not take a drop of alcohol into his mouth. And I knew that he can, if he desires, drink a decent dose. Then I understood that he came in case the feast turns into a drinking bout that can grow into a scandal. And that almost happened. After the first or second toast, Sasha Shirayev came up to me and whispered, "In the corridor, the Zaporozhye people, already having drunk or making noise, terribly offended at the Minsk people that they were not invited to the solemn dinner about the completion of works. It is necessary to talk with them." Indeed, I was against inviting them to the common table. Now, after many years recalling those events, I understood that I acted incorrectly. I should have left my grievances to myself. In these 3 months, they spoiled us so much blood with their ambitions. They interfered more than helped to complete the work in time. There were 3 of them. If their position at the middle stage, I still could somehow understand. The question was being decided whose KSHM communication scheme is primary, ours or theirs. Then at the last stage, when it concerned tests and the act, they behaved like swine. But the work was finished. The toast to successful completion of the Volgograd stage of work was drunk. I was ready to shake hands, reconcile, and invite them to our table. But it was not so. The Zaporozhye people drank in their room and now expressed only offense, anger, and threats. This was exactly that case. Neither I nor Shirayev could talk them around. They did not accept our apologies. We had not managed to return to our room when a new emergency, Yona Makarevich, an employee of the department that provided various needs on field work, shipping and receiving cargoes, ensuring lodging and so on, why they sent him to Volgograd, I do not know, drank only 100 grams of vodka and went wild. Usually a calm, polite, diligent person, after 100 grams turned into a real brawler. Dishes, chairs flew to the floor. It was good that neighbors did not let him overcome the table. He became insane. He did not perceive any words of those around. With enormous difficulty, he was taken to another room and put into bed, after which he calmed down and fell asleep. The next day he was quiet. On his face, a guilty smile was drawn. He did not want to talk about last evening. He probably had his nervous system not in order, and it was a lesson for us. One must know with whom you sit down at a table with drink. Not for nothing did V.I. Bazhanov, having sat with us at the table, not take a drop of alcohol into his mouth. But into these two events he did not interfere, although watched them attentively. The next day we flew to Minsk. Preparation for the exercises went in full swing. Crews of radio operators, automation specialists were being formed for all KSHM. All the guys in my department who could endure riding in the MTLBU were mobilized for participation in the exercises. After the exercises, the new KSHM were placed in the hangar at Polyana. On the site stood all types of KSHM on MTLBU. Marshal Belov conducted an inspection of equipment after the exercises. He was accompanied by a retinue. Podrezov warned me, so that the vehicles would be in working condition, people at places. If necessary, be ready to give clear explanations. He will try to bring Marshal Belov to these KSHM. Indeed, he brought Belov to the hangar where the new KSHM stood. Podrezov began to tell him, here are new KSHM on a transport base different from MTLBU, significantly more convenient and more reliable in work. He suggested going inside the vehicle and making sure of this. Belov, not even listening to Podrezov to the end, waved his hand and said, we do not need these vehicles, turned and left to his retinue. The fate of the new KSHM was decided by one contemptuous wave of the hand.
Belov's position on the inability for automation to be introduced at the tactical level ensured that new vehicles never got off the ground. He continued to argue that they were not needed, despite mountains of evidence to the contrary. To this day, it remains a mystery why he was so against these concepts. It's possible that these ideas were born from a profound indifference towards the program. This is demonstrated within his memoirs, where he fails to mention the platform even once. It's also likely that he couldn't accept that the technology he trained to comprehend was fading into obsolescence, and that ultimately the structure he worked to pioneer would be surpassed. In 1981, after a period of debugging, a commission was formed to evaluate Maneuver prior to its adoption. It would be tested in early September, as the Zapad 81 exercises transpired. To evaluate the functionality of the complex, a 3-day divisional drill was engaged.
Before these exercises, as always, a mobilization was announced at the Institute. All specialists who could endure trips in the MTLBU and the BMP were involved in preparing for the 3-day exercises and participating in them. On the eve of the exercises, the equipment was checked. In the morning, from our base in Pechia, we were to depart for the range to the initial area. At the controls of the KSHM and in the navigator seats, there were to be soldiers and sergeants of the service company. Because of the very weak training, the company's radio operators did not participate in the exercises. The division commander and his officers were to appear in our KSHM only at the range.
This was complicated by the fact that the switching equipment remained problematic. Those behind the system refused to cooperate with OKB-864 to resolve these issues. This, of course, gave ammunition to Maneuver's critics, who made sure that each of the team's errors were remembered by the Commission. To resolve these issues, OKB-864 submitted proposals to produce the switching equipment themselves, which ended in disaster. However, this was not the only issue encountered during the mock operation. Those called up for the test were not experienced with the equipment, and therefore had to be brought up to speed in record time, with the help of representatives from OKB-864.
A single press of a key on the codegram input panel was accompanied by multi-story profanity addressed to automation and everything connected with it. With fingers spread, he jabbed at the PNFK. On the screen, naturally, gibberish popped up, after which appropriate words were uttered towards the developers and industry. At times, in anger, he allowed himself to physically apply force to Lach. Kolya tried to press himself into the side armor and stay behind the division commander's outstretched arm.
Eventually, familiarity was established and the system received a positive review from the division's command staff.
He looked at the map mounted on a special map board and marked it with his symbols. The automated workstation equipment made it possible to automatically plot onto the map the necessary data contained in a message received in the form of a codegram. He almost worked silently and with complete concentration, thoroughly familiar with both his duties and the new equipment. Later he would say, one of the principal advantages of command and control using automated systems was that there was no need to raise one's own voice when issuing commands and instructions. Division officers who took their duties seriously could quite successfully and quickly master the subtleties of working at the automated workstation. Whoever was too lazy to do that cursed automation to high heaven. Division officers very much disliked the fact there was a printing device in the KSHM. All transmitted and received messages were documented. Now when making decisions and issuing orders, one had to learn how to use one's head. Not everyone was capable of that.
The test was to be relatively comprehensive. The first day would see the unit on the march towards their designated deployment zone, after which they would assume a defensive posture, and on the third day the formation would embark on a counterattack and pursue an imagined enemy.
The time came to transition to the offensive. We quickly, as much as we could, rolled up the wire lines, switched on the radio stations, checked radio communications, and in column moved after the troops to a new command post location. All of the staff officers, together with their commander, jumped into their wheeled BTRs and left. We got into our KSHM and also drove off. By the time the movement began, Vil Ivanovich Goncharov, our chief engineer, arrived from somewhere. He sat in the commander's seat, put on a headset, and tied into the KSHM internal communications. I on that vehicle took the navigator's seat. The whole column, in the lead vehicle, was led by someone from the military. Standing on the seat with one's head out the hatch was dangerous. We were driving on a forest road, and one could impale oneself on a tree branch. We had to sit, looking at the road through the little window or the triplex, very inconvenient. I could see the unevenness of the road, and before the next pit would transmit over the internal communications, "Hold on, pit." All 5 members of the crew in the middle and rear compartments were riding blind, not knowing at what moment there would be the next impact, and the road was broken up, churned by tracked vehicles. If the driver, missing the next pit, does not slow down, and the vehicle at speed smacks its nose into the ground, then the inside of everyone sitting in the vehicle are twisted. If there is no helmet headset on the head, then serious head injuries against all sort of metal parts, sharp corners of the equipment, are inevitable. At the nearest halt, Vil Ivanovich climbed out of the vehicle with some strange smile on his face. We did not see him again until the very end of the exercises. We were hungry and angry. In the morning, they did not even feed us breakfast. We had to leave so quickly. Suddenly, a Gazik drew level with us, and N.I. Azimatov jumped out of it. We stopped. He came up and asked how things were. We complained that we had been hungry since morning. Azimatov left, and about 30 minutes later, a truck drove up to us with a starshina sitting in the bed. "Ordered to give you dry rations. How many people are in the vehicle?" He handed each of us a box with a dry soldier's ration and a loaf of bread. Crews of all KSHM were given such rations. The ration had 2 to 3 cans of preserved food, sugar, tea in a bag, something else. Until the end of the day, we had quite enough of that food, even with some to spare. Fighting became more cheerful. Now the bumpy road was endured more easily. As before, there was not a single staff officer in our KSHM. They were moving somewhere in their native BTRs. The exercises ended for us. We went off to rest in Minsk, having received a couple days off. On a large sheet of graph paper, an axonometry, I depicted all blocks of the KSHM communications means complex. I showed in different colors the path where telecode and voice signals wander. This drawing was called Communications Means Complex of a Typical KSHM of the ASUV M. Lyona Pihor, an employee of my department, he had some artistic gift, drew well, brought this drawing into an aesthetic form. He drew radio stations, APD, AVSK, and other blocks with a view of the control panels. He successfully tinted the drawing. It turned out a very visual, simple to understand document. I showed it to Azimuthov, gave oral explanations, and I liked the drawing. And he said something like, "This is what we needed." That drawing did not return to me anymore. But from his folder, and Azimuthov would take it out, I saw repeatedly, explaining to those not in the know what the KSHM KSS is. After some time, he summoned me and said, on such and such date, to be in Moscow, in our directorate, and wait for him. We are going to a meeting at the Military Industrial Commission, VPK, regarding AVSK. From Zaporozhye there will be Gazinsky, at that time chief designer of AVSK. At the appointed time, I was in Moscow and awaited Azimuthov. He appeared and said, "Let's go to the Kremlin, to a meeting at the VPK. Passes are ordered for us." Nikolai Ilyasovich knew how and liked sometimes to shock the interlocutor with loud phrases. I, of course, was dumbfounded, staring at Azimuthov, and he was smirking, satisfied with the produced effect. We received passes at the entrance at the Spasskaya gates of the Kremlin, then entered some large building, walked along a long corridor covered with a carpet runner. At the corners of the side branches of the long corridor stood young guys in military uniform. Their role, I think, consisted in that visitors, like us, would not wander around the corridors, and I walked confidently, not for the first time here, occasionally commenting, "Here is this, and there out the window you could see the building where the most important meetings are held." We came into the needed room. In it, there are 2 writing tables and a 3rd table for conversations with visitors. At it already sat B.M. Gazinsky, a presentable uncle, came up to us. I will call him that, because I did not remember his position in Familia, although Azimuthov told it to me. He put a document on the table and said that we, representatives of enterprises, needed to coordinate and sign, visa, the draft decision on development of a new AVSK at the Zaporizhzhia plant Radio Pribor. At these words, Gazinsky almost fell off the chair. The uncle continued that the State Commission at the ASUV tests made serious remarks on the unsatisfactory work of communications means in the KSHM because of shortcomings of AVSK, poor interfacing of communication means during their joint operation. Boris Mikhailovich tried to object. Supposedly, in their products, the AVSK works normally, and there are no complaints about its work. Here the uncle raised his voice so, looking at Gazinsky, that until the end of the conversation, his desire to open his mouth fell away. The uncle said, addressing Gazinsky, "You are here, not in order to justify yourself and object, but in order to concretely seek the solution of the posed task." Azimuthov, meanwhile, took out from the folder our drawings of the KSS, unfolded it, and in a few phrases explained to the uncle what the KSHM KSS represents, and where the AVSK is that complexes the joint work of all communications means. The words complexing and KSS pleased the uncle so much that he played them several times in the spoken phrases. It was said that AVSK for the ASUV must be developed according to the TTZ of the Chief of the Communication Troops. The TTZ must be coordinated with the Chief Designer of the ASUV Maneuver. After this, he proposed to Azimuthov and Gazinsky to put coordinating signatures. I do not remember, but it seems that in the discussed draft decision during our conversation, no popravki were introduced. For the whole time of our conversation, I did not have to explain something. I did not sign the document. It turns out that I played the role of a statistic. After a session meeting, Azimuthov, confidently striding along the corridors, led me to the dining room. About 2 weeks later, Azimuthov summoned me again. He reported that in a couple of days, Belov is convening at his place a big meeting on the results of state tests. I should at such and such time wait for Azimuthov in the directorate of our ministry. Together, we will go to the meeting to Belov. At the appointed time, we came to the building on the embankment where the Ministry of Defense was located, and there was a residence of the NVS Marshal Belov. We received passes, came to the assembly hall. This is a huge room, which was about 4 times larger than Podrezov's office in our institute. A small, low stage. On it stands with demonstration posters. A table behind which Belov will sit. Opposite the stage, a huge U-shaped table, 2 ends of which abut into the stage. Along the side walls, a long line of chairs. One long side of the table was allotted to civilian representatives. Behind the other, the military were seated. Azimatov sat at the table. I sat on a chair by the wall behind his back. Gaizinski also sat by the wall, which means that at the table there was someone from his leadership. At the table sat many military men in ranks not lower than lieutenant colonel. The meeting was conducted by Belov. The report was made by Malyuchkov Anatoly Andreevich, head of the Department of the 16th TSNIIS of the Ministry of Defense, accompanying the theme of ASUV-M. They considered the results of the tests of the ASUV-M with remarks of the State Commissions on Communications. Malyuchkov began the report. He had not managed to address one of several hanging posters when Belov rudely cut him off, and it went 2-3 phrases of the reporter, constant rude remarks, reproaches, and accusations. This all happens in the presence of 100 military and half 100 civilian persons. Soon Belov took up the officers sitting at the table, especially one colonel from the Leningrad Military Academy of Communications got it. Belov called the colonel's surname. He jumped straight into the attention stance, listened to several sharp, insulting phrases, after which he heard, "Sit down!" After 20 to 30 seconds, again a sharp remark followed. The colonel jumped up, received a portion of rude reproaches, after which followed, "Sit down!" After a minute, everything repeated. I with difficulty understood that the colonel headed some department and did not ensure proper participation in the tests of the ASUV in order to prove, with communications in the troops, everything is all right. Sharp and rude remarks addressed to Malyuchkov alternated with putting out from behind the table colonels. For some reason, he did not put generals at the attention stance. This was public mocking, beating of senior officers. All of them, as they say, took the salute, silently endured public insults. All accusations boiled down to one: did not watch, did not consider, did not ensure, failed, did not report in time, and so on and so forth. Consideration of questions on the merits, searching for solutions of the identified problems, was not. In the act of the State Commission, many remarks were written addressed to Belov's services, so he had reason to worry, to be angry. But to insult respectable people like that, I was shocked. After these scenes played by Marshal Belov, I lost all respect for him. I related critically to A.A. Malyuchkov for his arrogance and lack of objectivity during the tests of ASUV. Sometimes his incompetence in certain communications questions and unwillingness to listen to good advice was striking. But at this meeting, I sincerely felt sorry for him. In the so-called communications department, which supposedly had to solve some communications questions for Minsk for the ASUV-M, consisted of 1 military retiree, 3 women of unknown specialties, not communications, and Maslov Alexander Nikolaevich. Maslov produced a pleasant impression as a person, but his knowledge in the area of communications for a mobile ASUV was close to zero. What kind of support of our theme and the communications part could he ensure and also coordinate the TTZ on equipment? Besides, due to family circumstances, he could not go on trips, and he had not seen one single of our objects with his own eyes, and was not present at tests. And then immediately, after the end of Belov's angry tirade, a colonel, more precisely a captain first rank, Yakunin Vyacheslav Mikhailovich, deputy head of 16th NIIS for Science, stands up and declares, "Comrade Marshal, allow 16th TSNIIS to lead the work on drawing up the TTZ for AVSK. I personally will conduct this work." Belov grunted and gave such an assignment to the initiative colonel. Soon, Yakunin VM became head of the 16th TSNIIS of the Ministry of Defense. A few words about Yakunin VM. He was a naval communications specialist. He graduated from some maritime institute in Leningrad. Judging by his manners, speech, behavior, he was a native Leningrader. He wore naval uniform even then when he fell into subordination to the ground force man Belov. Belov could not stand the uniform of another branch of troops. He forced everyone to change uniform, but Yakunin defended his right to wear a naval uniform and irritated Belov's eyes. Yakunin knew me and Yan VI. head of the department that dealt with questions of data transmission in the ASUV. If we met on the territory of 16th TS and IIS, treated us with coffee, asked about work on the theme M. He was very courteous. This even somewhat surprised me, but Yakunin's Leningrad origin could explain a lot. So Yakunin VM showed initiative on working out, coordinating the TTZ on AVSK. After that, the sharpness of the meeting somehow began to subside. Or maybe Belov simply got tired of mocking his subordinates.
It was at this time that a considerable lapse in judgment materialized. The program requirements had been produced without any consensus on the system's wider architecture. This meant that almost all of these aforementioned requirements were fluid and could be modified without any input from the organizations working on Maneuver. This allowed Belov to mandate the inclusion of increasingly absurd requirements in pursuit of his mission to maintain compatibility with the existing organization present within the signal troops. To beat Belov at his own game, Azamatov decided to use the bureaucracy he had weaponized against him, by forcing the provision of comprehensive diagrams demonstrating how certain systems would be integrated into the network. This was not something that Belov could contest, as it was OKB-864's right to demand this information.
Finally, in the Act of the State Commission, there appeared an entry: provide the developer with the communication scheme of the tactical echelon. What a howl rose from the side of the military communications specialists. They asserted that it was impossible to do, because such a scheme does not exist in nature. Azamotov's answer was laconic. It does not exist? Then develop it, approve it, and present it to us. You are the ones forcing us to use only what exists. On the communication schemes in mandatory order, it must be indicated all radio nets, all correspondence in them, all mobile objects with radio stations installed with them, the types of these radio stations, all directions of communications, and all means of division communications company. Military communications specialists could in no way decide the question who will be the author of the scheme, its main developer. The scheme had to take into account all requirements prescribed to us in the TTZ on the tactical echelon of the ASUV-M. 16th TS NIIS pointed a finger towards the Leningrad Military Academy of Communications. They, supposedly, deal with questions of communications organization. From there they showed, a fig towards 16th TS NIIS and reminded for what reason and when the group of General Zakharov GP, which dealt with questions of communications organization in the tactical echelon for the ASUV, was dispersed and the general dismissed. Then they decided to connect the Head Institute on Communications from industry, NII-SSU. But there, in the department that dealt with communications in the lowest echelons of control, sat such dilettantes that from this idea it was necessary, Tadkazatsia.
One of the final requirements mandated by the State Commission was the creation of a unique workstation which would be employed by an automated specialist at the divisional level. This made little sense as automation fell under the jurisdiction of the Chief of Communications, already present at divisional level. These automation specialists would have to be sourced from the divisional signal company. More specifically, its officers, who would require an automated workstation of their own to interface with the network. That workstation would come to be known as PUSAS, or the Point of Control of Automation and Communication Means. This unconventional title was conceptualized to theoretically separate the Chief of Communications and those managing automated subsystems. So it would appear, at least to some megalomaniacs, Belov, that automation and conventional communications were actually totally separate concepts and not unified. The deliberate nature of this title is exemplified by the decision to employ the terminology communication means as opposed to automated control of communications. This would leave no illusions that the signal troops were still a wholly independent branch that had not fallen to the decadent influence of OKB-864 in their dastardly schemes. Despite his objections, many associated with military communications at this time could sense that Belov, and his supporters, understood that automation was the future, but could not accept that they had been routed by this promising new technology.
In July 1985, in Borisov and Kolodishi, a demonstration was held and exercises conducted using both tactical echelon complexes and operational level command posts with the use of the staff vehicles of the front ASUV. Representatives of the general staffs of the Warsaw Pact countries were invited to the events. It was precisely after this exercise that conversations began about transforming the communication troops into troops of control and communications. A number of officials did not like these conversations very much, since the status of the communication troops would rise significantly. Therefore, the matter did not go beyond conversations and no practical steps were taken. And with the arrival in 1988 of the new Chief of Communications, General Kovets Konstantin Ivanovich, automation issues were pushed into the far corner, and in the 90s were finally buried.
However, despite the controversy surrounding its existence, PUSAS did actually end up fulfilling two important roles. The first of which was calculating compatible radio frequencies and assigning reserve radio frequencies, while the second consisted of routing messages throughout the network.
It was difficult for us to imagine the PUSAS, which we considered the KSHM of the Chief of Communications, equipped with automation means that were not needed by the Chief of Communications. Therefore, we ourselves began to meet with active chiefs of communications in the Belarusian military district. We talked with them. We explained the possibilities of the KSA and the KSHM. The answers were astonishing. Nothing! They were afraid of the very word automation as of fire. To say anything for this idea meant risking one's career. One might not even reach retirement in a decent position. They knew about the harsh reaction of the leadership when, at the summing up of one of the large exercises involving the Tactical Echelon Maneuver, the Chief of Staff of the division, Sivakov UL, spoke in support of automated control methods. The only thing we achieved from the Chief of Communications was that we received samples of forms which they filled out when planning communications. The forms of these blanks were entered into the onboard EVC. They would be called from the EVC memory to the display of the workplace, filled in, printed, returned to the EVC for storage, or transmitted via telecode communications to addresses. The possibility was implemented using automation means to apply to the map and read data concerning communications in division's zone of operations.
Documentation was developed and the team submitted an order to manufacture a prototype, which was expected to cost roughly 1 million rubles. Following its acceptance in 1990, none were manufactured, and the program fell through.
The forces of the departments were thrown into preparing and coordinating the decree of the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of Ministers of the USSR on the fate of work on troop automation. Such decree came out in February 1980. By the decree, the Tactical Echelon Complex of the Front, ASUV, consisting of 26 KSHM and SM, were adopted into service and put into trial operation. Work on its modernization and procedure for producing complexes for the nearest period were defined. The list of measures for developing the work was clarified, and rewards for the completed work were announced.
There is some disagreement as to when this happened. In the book 40 Years in Command and Control Automation, these events supposedly took place in 1982. 12 vehicles would be adopted at this time. MP-21, MP-22, MP-23, MP-24, MP-25, and the Beta 3M computer carrier. Maneuver would eventually be delivered in limited numbers to Warsaw Pact allies.
In 1986, a special exercise was conducted in which all the forces and means of radio counteraction of the Belarusian military district were deployed against an advancing tank division. Despite such a concentration of forces to disrupt command and control, the command system of this division was not suppressed. This once again confirmed the necessity of broad application of a new type of communications, data transmission, for troop control. The main means of command information exchange in these exercises was the use of APD channels for combat control.
These exercises were not entirely ordinary for us. Previously, we had not had to work under conditions of deliberate interference, although there was enough interference of other kinds. As always, we prepared for the necessary documents and selected compatible frequencies for the radio stations, primary and reserve. I paid special attention to briefing our radio operators. As always, there was no hope that military signalmen would work in our KSHM. In all radio nets, main stations were designated. In these KSHM, our most experienced signalmen were to be present. Sasha Shireyev, Teli Viznir, Volodya Volodchev, Lona Gribov, Sasha Blokhin, and others. They were assigned a special role. It was necessary to monitor information exchange very carefully, including by ear, noticing anything unusual. The ability of radio operators to monitor the condition of telecode radio nets was very limited. Auditory monitoring, a very tiring activity, and observation of indicator lights on one of the panels of the APD basalt. These indicators were difficult to see from the radio operator's workplace. To understand what the rapidly blinking LEDs mean requires exceptional ability. One had to know perfectly the processes occurring in the APD and think very quickly. All information about telecode exchange, so necessary in this case, was hidden inside the APD and was not output beyond it. I have already written that the developer and customer of the APD refused for unspecified reasons to implement this. If a radio operator noticed any factors disrupting communication, he was required to immediately report this to the main station in the net using telecode communications, including bypass routes. I knew my military specialty was radio reconnaissance and interception. That is how experienced OSNAS officers taught us during training camp, that an enemy begins electronic warfare with radio reconnaissance, first attempting to determine the affiliation of radio nets. Otherwise, resources of electronic suppression, REP, might be wasted suppressing false nets. In doing so, REP stations would inevitably reveal themselves and provoke counteraction. Determining the affiliation of telecode radio networks is extremely difficult. There are almost no intelligence indicators. For telecode transmission, a transmitter appears on the air for fractions of a second, a short codogram less than a second. Radio reconnaissance can determine the frequency, analyze exchange intensity, locate a stationary transmitter. Our KSHM could operate while moving and exchanging telecode messages. Some signs, messages, and acknowledgments might suggest that basalt equipment is operating. This is about all reconnaissance could detect. Voice radio nets were entirely different. They had many intelligence indicators, voice call signs, digital calls from device R012, negotiations for secure communications, speech patterns, code tables, and much more. Such nets were often more useful to monitor than suppress. On the evening before the exercise, something occurred that dismayed me. Our leader, N.I. Azimatov, ordered me to provide EW services with all our radio data, primary and reserve frequencies of all nets and their call signs. Our objects were involved in about 30 radio nets. I objected. I argued that this placed us in a very disadvantageous position. Without effort, the enemy EW service would receive a full picture of our communications. Let them first attempt to determine the affiliation of our nets, and only then suppress them. This made the game dishonest. Azimatov did not accept my objections and confirmed the order. I had to hand over all radio data. I do not know the reason. Perhaps it was simply an arrangement. You to us, we to you. Possibly the EW service feared embarrassment. They could not determine our net affiliations through reconnaissance and asked for a head start. After this unpleasant procedure, realizing the game would be unfair, we urgently selected additional reserve frequencies from our arsenal. Soon, radio operators noticed deliberate jamming of our frequencies. We had to switch to reserves. Sasha Shirayev was the first to identify deliberate jamming. The noise appeared only when someone transmitted. The jammer used a primitive algorithm designed for voice networks. Within minutes, Shirayev deciphered the jammer's logic and found a workaround. He prepared short codograms and waited. When the jammer paused to evaluate suppression success, Shirayev pressed transmit, and the message shot into the ether before the interference resumed. The main station transmitted a circular telecode order to switch to reserve frequency. Exchange continued. One transmitter remained on the primary frequency to simulate activity. Let the enemy believe the suppression was successful. Until the end of the exercise, the enemy continued strangling an empty frequency. All radio operators were informed via telecode of the interference characteristics and workaround. The internal telecode net was later suppressed with powerful target interference. Again, Shirayev switched to a reserve frequency using bypass routes. Exchange continued. At the end of the exercises, we were shown the jammer station Ukol. Designed in Ukraine, it was considered state-of-the-art and awarded the USSR State Prize. This super device, whose algorithm Shirayev deciphered in 5 minutes, operated automatically. Panoramic receiver monitored the band. On detecting activity on marked frequency, jammer activated. Then it paused to listen to assess results. During listening intervals, Shirayev inserted codograms. For telecode nets, Ukol proved ineffective. It might have suppressed voice nets effectively, but we avoided voice mode.
Following this feat, Maneuver would begin to penetrate the battalion level, massively expanding the network's capabilities. After which, almost as if to add insult to injury, Perestroika would achieve what Belov couldn't: and destroy Maneuver before it can see continued investment.
By decree of the CPSU, Central Committee, and USSR Council of Ministers, awards were provided for distinguished developers. NIISA received around 200 orders and medals. One state prize was allocated. Documents were prepared and sent to Moscow. All signatures were obtained except one. Marshal Belov, the general customer, he refused to sign. And as a result, the state prize was never awarded. Signing would have meant admitting that for over 10 years, his opposition to automated command methods was mistaken.